Hi everybody and welcome back to Unit 2. Today we're talking about traditional security versus human security, and I have to be honest right off the bat, this isn't a very good title because it really isn't an either or a competitive sort of thing, a choice that the UN has made between traditional security and human security. It's more just designed to set it off as a different approach, a different focus between the two concepts. Traditional security is something that the UN was primarily focused on when it's founded in 1945, and that's primarily what the UN Charter is written about. But the organization has evolved as that organizational chart we've looked at a couple of times has taken shape. The focus has shifted in large part to human security. Doesn't mean they're no longer paying attention to traditional kinds of security concerns, but it means that the major focus has shifted to human security as well, particularly as bodies like the General Assembly and the Economic and Social Council and all of their sub-agencies have been doing their work. That focus has shifted. There's also part that to play in this is something we'll be looking at in topic 4, which is peacekeeping, peacemaking, and peace building. I don't want to blow the next lecture, so I'll leave that for you, but it's basically a different focus of traditional security and human security as we go along. So let's talk about the evolution of this concept over time. So traditional security concerns come out of the Second World War. As you know from past conversations, the main purpose of the United Nations as conceptualized in the UN Charter is to prevent there being a World War III. Traditional security, conflict between states is what the focus is. So this is a photo of Japanese soldiers in the Second World War. They're looking at that sort of major patterns of ways in which countries tend to go to war against one another. And the UN Charter is structured to protect against that. So yes, we've got this concept of domestic jurisdiction embedded in the Charter. But then you've got this, the discussion in the Charter about international peace and security. It's in chapters 5, 6, and 7, which are about the Security Council. So there are some things very clearly delineated in there that the Security Council and by extension the UN as a whole is allowed to do to try and maintain international peace and security. So that phrase is not in there just sort of as an afterthought. It's the central tenet here. It's designed to prevent wars between countries and by extension another world war. So you can do things like begin to talk about disarmament, to work on mediation initially, then to do non-lethal forms of persuasion such as sanctions, such as closing airspace and that sort of thing, all the way to organizing an actual military force. So that's the focus of the Security Council and the UN Charter. But as comes to be clear over time, that's not the only kind of threat that faces the world, and so the Security Council pivots very quickly, particularly, certainly by the 1950s, to interstate war or intrastate war. I'm sorry, so wars within states, and to asymmetrical warfare. The focus, though, initially is the kind of war they were having during the Second World War that leads them to conceptualize security as traditional security concerns, international peace and security, conflict between states. So they're looking at the causes of it and the consequences of war between the states. So the next thing to consider isn't jumping straight to human security. Human security is a concept that really emerges as a major focus in the 1990s, but it's into asymmetrical and non-traditional military threats. Or if they're not military, they're at least involve the military. So these would be things like terrorism or the threats brought about by climate change, where the world or individual countries are threatened with destabilization. And if you have destabilization of countries, then your conflict can ensue. The traditional kinds of conflict that we're talking about before. So you would have non-traditional paths to traditional kinds of conflict. So initially, they're not military, but there could be a role for the military. So on the left here is a photo of terrorist attacks in India, which has had some really quite horrific attacks in recent years. They're ones that are largely unknown in the West. They don't get reported on in quite the same way. And on the right is the glacier that used to cover all of Mount Kilimanjaro in Northeast Africa as the glacier retreats. So both of these are types of non-traditional asymmetrical threats that the Security Council has dealt with. So these, though, are extensions of traditional security. They're called non-traditional because it isn't the state going to war against another state, but they are still a focus on large patterns, global or at least transnational, things that impact the entire world. And you will be able to say that human security concerns impact the entire world, but they're felt locally. They're felt in individual families or by specific individual people. Human security is a focus on the day-to-day ability of people to live, thrive, and survive. And as those people relate to their families, and as their families relate to communities, and then the communities to the states, that's where the security becomes a concern for the wider global community. Where this comes from, in large measure, is the end of the Cold War and a hope that traditional forms of conflict are a thing of the past. One of the things that had been noted by the United Nations and other groups, certainly scholars and other experts looking at conflict from 1945 to the end of the Cold War, was that democracies did not go to war against one another. And therefore, if you could institute democracies around the world as part of your development program, that you would have less and less likelihood of there being traditional conflict. So how do you get to that point? What do you do? And the decision was to focus on human security, and it's linked back to development, which we looked at in the last lecture, and have those things sort of linked together in a way that promotes a stable, peaceful society. And if you look at most measures, from the end of the Cold War to the present, at least until 2015, there's been some changes in the last couple of years. The patterns were all to more stability, more health, less poverty, and better socioeconomic measures across the board. It doesn't mean that there weren't some people losing out, but the majority of the efforts seem to be bearing fruit. This concept of human security then becomes the way we look at it. So what this means is a focus on different levels, a more individualized level than other measures might. So you're going to look at economic security, and now you're talking about an individual's ability to have employment. You're looking and a living wage. Food, that's the reliability of your ability to feed your family. Health, environment, personal safety, community security, political reliability. These things together forming this nexus of human security. There's a video for you to watch here as part of this this topic that will help get you there. This relates back to a major definition of health. This is the mission statement from the World Health Organization says that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So if you're talking about complete social well-being, then you have to pay attention to individuals on a very different level. Now, human security is something that takes a lot more time and effort than traditional security. And it also relies on partnerships between the UN and non-governmental organizations and states. So let's pop back to the charter conversation again, right? You've got domestic jurisdiction. Human security relies on the ability of the UN to partner with states and to come in and do stuff in their domestic sphere. So one of the things that domestic jurisdiction would imply here in traditional security would be that that there's maybe not a right, but there's a right to be left alone if you're a country who's treating their citizens very poorly. That someone like Bashar al-Assad is more or less, in a horrible way, granted the right to treat his people how he wishes, because domestic jurisdiction overrides other concerns. That would be a concept which is bothersome. So if you want to do something in the country, you have to be invited to do something in the country. When we look at peacekeeping again next time, you're going to have to see that the right of the state, the UN, to come in and act relies on the state to invite them to do so. human security is this individual, family, community focus. As such, it requires the state to give permission for the UN to come in and act there. So by and large, that does happen. And the UN is able to get in and do programs in different places. The exception is if there's a belief that the UN and or its partner agencies, those would either be the development agencies of a place like the United States, the USAID, or Australia with AusAid, Canada with CanAid. So those are formal development programs from countries. And or non-governmental organizations are fair and equal partners with them and not working against the interest of that state. So Bashar al-Assad and other dictators like him will be uncomfortable with human security approaches in their country if the NGO, the UN, bodies that are in there acting and or the federal, the other national aid agencies seem to be working against their purposes. In other words, if there's an organization that's in providing aid to people to help with their human security, and they also criticize the government, they risk being kicked out of the country because they're there at the invitation as a partner with the country. It makes it particularly difficult to do some programs in places where the state is not an equal partner. That's sort of this yes but concept I've got right here, where yes, the United Nations is doing this work. There's a trust fund for human security where lots of money has been invested to try and help develop this differently from what they're doing on the different development goals, the Human Development Index, and the MDGs and the SDGs, we'll look later. But you have trouble with the partners. You also have trouble sometimes where fragility of a state and or corruption intersect with attempts to establish human security. So on the left you have something called the Fragile States Index, which is published each year. This measures the likelihood of a state collapsing, and basically the government collapsing and civil war ensuing, or some sort of vacuum established or developing when the government collapses. So here's 16 states that are on very high alert or on high alert for collapsing as a country, and some of them are surprising, perhaps particularly in the second category, that they're so high ranked, like Nigeria and Pakistan, but they have interesting societies that sort of hover right there on the edge. Corruption also plays a role. So this is public sector corruption. That's the government and other federal officials. So the darker the color on this map, on the right, the worse the perceived corruption is, and often the perception is basically you're going around and talking to business people about what they expect when they go into these countries. The lack of human security, fragility, and corruption tend to go together. And so when the UN's trying to establish human security in these states, you don't necessarily have a viable, functional partner. So there's the one concern that it's a dictator or another authoritarian who doesn't want the UN and their partners there with development, and then because they might be criticized. But if you overcome that, you still risk the problem of your partnerships, because all of this relies on formal, official partners between the United Nations, development agencies from different states, and NGOs. So if you don't have that, then you don't have the ability to work on human security at all. Now, the overriding concern is still, there is still an overriding concern for traditional security. In other words, when North Korea is doing its crazy thing with nuclear weapons and threatening to set up hydrogen bombs and things like that, that's going to be an immediate topic of conversation at the Security Council. Immediately, they're going to talk about what Bashar al-Assad is doing and what the rebels are doing in Syria. That doesn't mean they'll have an agreement on how to handle it, but there are topics that are of immediate concern will be dealt with by the Security Council. But the rest of the apparatus is going to be working on human security issues nonstop. And they do overlap, as we'll look at when we look at peacekeeping, peace building, and peacemaking. But by and large, you have these efforts going on in parallel. The Security Council also talks about what used to be called non-traditional topics. We just looked at those, non-traditional security topics, often, like what the impact is of climate change or HIV/AIDS or other crises on traditional security. There's your takeaway. Keep in mind that since the Cold War ended, there was this belief that maybe we were done with war. We aren't done with war, but it gave rise to human security, and I think that at least is a positive development.